In this presentation, we're going to take a closer look at some of the physics components, and we'll just experiment a little bit with one of the platforms or ramps that we created. Now you can do this with a new cube. In fact, I'll create a cube, a temporary game object here that we can tinker with, and I'm just going to scale the X up a little bit to be a little bit more consistent with some of the other platforms that I have. Because I want to play around with a couple of elements within physics. So I'm just going to align this into a space where I'm certain that the sphere is going to find its way onto this platform. That looks pretty good, although it is a little close to the foreground. So I'll just kind of push that back just a little bit. And just for the sake of consistency, to get a little bit of contrast here, I'll throw one of these simple materials onto my platform. Now, with this platform selected, what I want to do is I want to experiment with a hinge joint. Now, there are a couple of different kinds of joints that we can play with, but a hinge is going to give us some basic capability that we should be able to experiment with here in pretty simple terms. And so I just have a standard cube selected. I'm going to go to Components, Physics, and I'll choose hinge joint. Now when I do, we inherit two components. Unity adds a rigid body component for us. We need a rigid body in order for this to work. And then we have the hinge joint component. So the moment we hit play, we'll start to see some kind of result here. So we have this basic hinge that's been implemented. Now I want this to teeter in a slightly different direction. And if we zoom in, you'll see there's a very small axis that's running in line with the x-axis. And if we look closely at the hinge joint, we look down here, there's an axis field, and because it says +1 is in the x. So the x is +1, and that's declaring that the axis for the hinge runs in the direction of the x-axis. So if I zero this out and change Z to 1, it'll run in line with the blue axis, and we'll see this little orange, this little dark orange axis updated into the direction. In fact, if I just change Z to 1, it's still using +x, but it's also using +z. And so we can zoom in and see that from the center of this object, now the axis is running from corner to corner. So we don't have to just constrain this to just one axis. Right now it's kind of running off into the across two axes. But what I want is I want this to teeter along the blue axis. And so I'm going to zero out x. And so now in the center, I just have this real simple axis that acts as a hinge. Now I can move that hinge around. I can play with some of these values, and there's a number of things that I can do. Just remember that if we're overwhelmed by the number of options within this component, we can always click on the little question mark here and read about each one of the parameters. And of course, we can experiment as well. So if I want to modify the position of this hinge joint, as I kind of slide this around, you can see that that hinge is moving. I can, play with all these different values, but what I'm most interested in is using this spring. A little bit about halfway down in the hinge joint, we can see that there's a use spring, and if we check that, so there's a check mark, we can start to input some values in the spring and the dampener. We can ignore the target position for now, but if we increase the spring value, and I'll just choose something like 10, and I'll increase the dampening here in a moment, but with just having the spring value set to 10, you can see that actually, it looks like it got hung up. I anticipated seeing that kind of spring back into position. In fact, for the sake of the demo, let me just make the X a little bit shallower here, just to see if we can keep it from hanging up on our little tube. If not, we'll just move the tube here in a second. So there we go. We can see the spring. This geometry beneath it kind of interfered with it. And you can see it's kind of springing back and forth. The higher the spring value, the stronger that spring is going to be. So I'll bump that up to 20. And you can see that that's starting to become stronger. Now, the damper value is how quickly it comes to rest. And if I just going to type in a value of 5. That might be a little strong, but we'll see. We'll see that it won't react as quickly as it was before. It won't be as springy, and it just kind of, it still has a high strength, but it doesn't kind of spring back and forth, so it comes to rest much quicker. So we can play around and tinker with these values, and if we decide that we did something that we don't want, we can always click on this little cog here and tell it to reset the value. That did reset the axis, so now we're back in the X. The spring looks like it didn't reset the spring. I anticipated that was going to reset the spring. So let me just take a look here and see if there's any other options. I hit reset. So that just seemed to reset everything above spring. So I could just turn off spring if I wanted to get back to the default setup, and that should get me back into the same position. So at this point, I could move the anchors around a little bit here. I'm sliding. You can see the little widget here in the heads up display as I slide these values around. That's moving the hinge in the direction of X. If I just change this, I'll add 1 to Z and reduce X to 0. So now my hinge is running in this direction. I'll try to change this X value and see if I can get that hinge to move. And so I'm just sending that hinge further back over towards this edge. I'll hit the play button, and now we should see it kind of hinge over here. And you can see even the weight of itself just kind of pulled itself down. So we can start to play around with different values and different orientations. At this point, I'll turn the spring back on and I'll keep the same values. And now we should see some slightly different results. Okay, so I'm going to increase this spring value. So again, just something to kind of play with and tinker around. And of course, you can play with some of these other values and read about them. But I think that'll give you a couple of solutions to tinker with. So one last thing while I'm playing around in this space, I'm going to take my original cube that we were setting up as sort of a domino, and I'm going to call that domino. And I can quickly arrange these out into space. I'm going to duplicate this domino by choosing Command D or Control D. That gives me a duplicate, and I'll just slide this out a little bit. I'll duplicate again and slide the new one out. And this time I'll rotate it just a bit according to the y-axis. Maybe I'll do 15 degrees and see what that gives me. So I'll change my view to a kind of a more user-friendly view. And now I can just position this a little better. So I'll just kind of move that around. I'll duplicate it again, move it out, and I'll change this value to, let's say 25 or 30 or whatever. And I'm just kind of tinkering with these values, but you can see that I can really quickly kind of just duplicate this object, move it in space. I'll do one more for the sake of demo, and then try to get this sphere to bump into it and see what kind of calamity I can cause. So the key to this project is really just kind of experimenting with different solutions. I'm going to select this temporary cube and drag it out of the way. Hit play. See if we can get those dominoes to knock down. There we go. So I'm just, going to make a pass. I'm going to go back through and really experiment with different kinds of shapes, different kinds of options. In the next presentation, I'll make a real quick pass about staying organized and building your project so that you can deliver it to the discussion board and some of the other collateral material that will go along with it. So this is just kind of some stuff to keep in mind. Have fun, play with this. This is really about experimenting. In the event that you introduce an object and it gets out of control, if you're experimenting with hinges, just delete the game object. Making sure that we're saving as we move forward. And at this point, these projects, even though we've covered a lot of ground, they're not so complicated that if we get inspired or decide that we've started a design and want to try something else, we can try something off on the side workspace here, or create a new project or a new scene. Excuse me, not a new project, but a new scene, and just kind of experiment with different solutions. So experiment with cubes and spheres and materials and everything that we've looked at so far. But we'll make another pass here and talk about a little bit of housekeeping and where to save things and how to save things, and then finally the build process, and then how to submit. So have fun with this project. I'll post just a couple more presentations, and if you have any questions, again, post in the discussion board.